So, the lecture I'm about to give is far from resolved. The research I have undertaken has thrown up various methods of how to solve a problem like Artemisia. Lost works, misattributions, centuries of critical neglect, and the feminist cause have created a complex, iridescent frame that surrounds the work of Artemisia, changing colour depending on the approach you take. Artemisia Gentileschi embodies a debate which is currently raging and splitting apart the societal structures that for centuries have controlled influence, opportunity, and education. Artemisia was an artist and a woman, in charge of her own household, studio, and income. She lived as an exception to the rule in 17th century Italy. Her sex and the circumstances she was born into appointed her an equal in her field. So how do we resolve this discrepancy whilst delivering the respect she deserves as a painter? Do we lower our expectations of what women were able to achieve due to the historical context they were born into, and celebrate works we might consider mediocre if painted by a man? How do we assess and experience art? To reference Gombrich, are there artists or just artworks? Do we take Artemisia's personal story and apply it to her paintings? Or do we encounter the work at face value? Such questions require us to consider what we believe art to be. How relevant is the artist's biography to the existence of their artifact? Does a sensational biography provide a potent palette, accessible only to the damned? These questions are particularly pertinent to an artist such as Artemisia and could easily be applied to figures such as Van Gogh. Her story has come to eclipse her work and is often promoted as illustration to her novel. So how do we access these works in a way that feels genuine to her achievement as an artist? Excuse me. I do not wish to dwell upon her personal story, but nor do I wish to ignore it. We are all victims of tragedy at one time or another, and I do not for 1 minute believe that the greater the tragedy, the greater the art. More likely, the greater the access to wealth, power, and education, the greater the art. It is not Artemisia's personal story that makes her exceptional. It is her response to all she endures. Artemisia Gentileschi was born in Rome in 1593, the elder sibling of 3 younger brothers. Her mother died in childbirth when she was 12. Her father, Orazio Gentileschi, an artist in his own right, taught Artemisia to paint before she could read or write. She rarely appeared in public, as was the custom of a respectable Roman, leaving only to attend mass. However, Orazio's attempts to protect his daughter proved insufficient. Artemisia was raped in her home in May 1611 by her father's friend and colleague, painter Agostino Tassi. In the immediate aftermath of the rape, Tassi promised to marry Artemisia, and their relationship became consensual during the months that followed. But when it was discovered Tassi was already married, Orazio filed a suit against him for injury and damage. Artemisia had been forcefully deflowered, and in turn had become the spoilt property of her father. The judge found Tassi guilty, and the day after his exile, Artemisia met and married Pier Antonio Stiassesi, a move that saved her from ruin or the convent. The infamous trial of spring of 1612 falls between the production of 2 paintings that have provided the basis of much interpretation regarding Artemisia's work. Susanna and the Elders was painted the year of the rape, and Judith and Holofernes shortly after the trial. Susanna and the Elders is signed and dated by Artemisia as being painted in 1610 when she was 17. Much has been made of this early attribution by scholars who doubt her capable of such a work at such a young age, although art historians have had no problem accepting Velasquez painted woman cooking eggs around 1618, when he too was in his late teens. Scholars have come to accept Artemisia must have had help from her father in the composition, and perhaps some of the modelling, which is probably true, but one imagines the sentiment is all hers. Susanna and the Elders was a popular theme for painters of the early Baroque period. It describes a story from the Bible of Susanna, the beautiful wife of the prominent Jew Joachim, whose community would regularly meet in his household. During one such gathering, two elders decided they would seduce Susanna when she was unattended by her maid at her bath. They ambushed her and threatened to accuse her of adultery in the garden with a young man if she did not succumb to their advances. She resisted, and as promised, the elders claimed she had committed adultery for which she was sentenced to death. But at the last minute, Daniel stepped forward to cross-examine the elders. He asked each to describe the tree under which Susanna had committed the sin. One said oak, the other a mastic. Susanna was declared innocent, and the elders were stoned to death for false testimony. The story was repeatedly painted by artists, but it was not the final scenes of the elders' execution or of Daniel stepping forward to save Susanna from death that patrons wanted to see. It was the moment the two elders approached the vulnerable, young, beautiful, and unclothed Susanna. As Mary J. Garrard, who wrote the first monograph on Artemisia in 1989, declares, few artistic themes have offered so satisfying an opportunity for legitimized voyeurism as Susanna and the Elders. It would have been a particularly titillating image of an enterprise considered by many men to not be a crime, but a crusade. The assumption in the case of rape was that the woman would have likely encouraged a man's advances in some way, and would therefore have enjoyed the forced sexual interaction. Such an attitude allowed for scenes of rape and attempted rape to be admired as examples of the highest category of art, history painting, which depicted scenes from mythology, antiquity, and the Bible. The rape of the Sabine women, painted by Peter Paul Rubens around 1635 and in the National Gallery's collection here in London, illustrates the legendary story of Rome. Built by Romulus to be an impressive city, Rome was unfortunately low on women. So the local Sabines who lived in a community nearby were invited to bring their wives and daughters to a festival, where Romulus then ordered the abduction of the women. The heightened drama, emotion, and violence of the scene is blasted across the canvas by Rubens, who fails to miss an opportunity to eroticize the horrendous assault upon the defenseless women, as breasts are bared and legs exposed. Another work in the National Gallery's collection describes an equally vivid version of sexual assault. Guido Reni's interpretation of Susanna and the Elders was painted in 1620-5. The attempted rape is proposed as a potentially willing exchange. Susanna is both surprised, fearful, hesitant, yet intrigued. She almost gently touches the Elder's hand as he clasps her robe, his other finger to his lip. He appears to make her complicit through silence. The suggestion is, I won't touch you unless you want me to. Garicino's version of 1617 forces the viewer to be an accomplice, as two rather excitable elders instruct us to hush as we join them in their sinister approach. The statue, like Susanna, is unaware of our intrusion, and we enjoy gazing upon her in the moments before she is terrified and alarmed. I might just have to pause one moment. I've just been told that there are many people trying to get in. Sorry, bear with us. Thank you for all being on time. Thank you. Welcome those who have just joined us. These aspects of the work all add up to interpretation that lets us off the hook as viewers. We are not made to feel shame in the voyeuristic assault we share with the elders, but are instead made to doubt it is an attack at all. This is the moment of Susanna's dilemma, as she ponders whether or not to give in to the advances made upon her, a state of mind imagined by Rainey, but never recognized by Artemisia. Her narrative is one of desperate rejection. There is no question of Susanna's trauma and determination to escape the elders' advances, who appear above her like leering puppets conspiring from behind a screen. Her eyes do not meet theirs. Her eyes do not meet theirs in a subtly seductive manner. Her body bends to avoid their touch, her hands outstretched in protection. We are not witness to a titillating encounter. We are witness to a woman in distress, who is horrified by the intrusion. But even Artemisia fulfills the brief. Only a slither of cloth obscures the thigh and pubic area, leaving a beautifully observed female figure available to the eyes of the audience, who arguably have a better view than the elders. Susanna's left breast is refreshingly real. It has the shape and weight of a breast. The nipple relates the anatomy it resides upon and does not just operate as a sign for a nipple, like a pimple on some soft mounds. Many an artist painted breasts as though they had never felt, caressed, or observed that part of the female body arguably leered upon the most. This could be because many were referenced from classical statues, existing compositions, memory, or imagination, because they did not have a wife or mistress willing to pose. One of the few advantages Artemisia could enjoy as a woman artist was access to not only her own breasts, but also the opportunity to paint from a range of female figures. It would have been more acceptable for women to pose for Artemisia, and more probable they would feel comfortable modeling for a woman who was unlikely to sexually assault them. Artemisia painted the female body with an unprecedented strength and honesty throughout her career, seen here in her Lucretia from 1621. Her response to the subject was undoubtedly different to that of her male peers, who routinely interpreted a woman's body as a symbol for sex, a realm to be conquered, a treasure trove of pleasure that was open to serve whatever male fantasy the female image might provoke. To Artemisia, a woman's body was an object that had been assaulted, tortured, swollen in pregnancy, battered through birth, and in mourning at the loss of 3 out of her 4 children. As this work shows, it was the strength that was at the heart of her early portrayals of women, the physicality of the figure, the broad shoulders and firm grasp of the breast that is not sexual, but in honor of her own body. The knee is like nothing I have ever seen in historical painting. It is solid and defiant, there to support, not to seduce. Women do not look like this in European painting, but they do in life. Lucretia is another woman from history whose attempt to remain chaste has been corrupted by misogyny. She commits suicide after being raped by a man jealous of her dedication to her husband. To avoid the shame of a rape she was powerless to prevent, she takes her own life. The majority of our historical depictions show Lucretia with the phallic-shaped dagger aimed between her bare breasts, this being Guido Reni's example. Artemisia chooses to show the moments of Lucretia's deliberation, a thinking woman who is weighing up her options, but who is yet to commit the knife to her chest. Lorenzo Lotto's portrait of Lucretia, again in the National Gallery's collection, was painted almost a century earlier in 1533, but it is a good example of the sort of image women would have had to endure as a reminder of how to behave. I was looking at this work back in September, October, and it began to make my blood boil. Imagine living with this portrait, commissioned by your husband on the occasion of your marriage. You grasp an image of a heroic suicide. The text on the table reads, after the example of Lucretia, let no violated woman live, basically saying, if you are raped, kill yourself to confirm your chaste character and unquestioned loyalty to your husband. Although the female figure is rather seductive, and according to historians, one of the most popular names for a 16th century Venetian prostitute was Lucretia. So perhaps the painting is an ironic joke. And if we are to accept the provenance of last November's recent record-breaking sale of a lost Artemisia of the same subject, we have to accept that she too delivers what the male market desires. Artemisia's early works emotively embody her personal experience as a young woman, but to reflect upon the origin of Artemisia's style rather than her content, it is useful to consider how she was indebted to the pictorial design of her father, Orazio. This is Artemisia's Madonna and Child from 1609 to 10, and her father Orazio's Virgin and Child from 1609. Orazio's work was often classical in aesthetic, with clear white light that falls across a spectrum of colour captured in luxurious fabrics. His figures are often rather stilted, conveying narrative through action rather than emotion, thought, or feeling, as seen here in The Finding of Moses from 1630, recently acquired by the National Gallery. The figures point to specifics in the story in a mechanical fashion, rather than express the sentiment of story through emotive reaction. Artemisia begins her professional career as an artist in Florence, where she lives from 1612 to 1621. Judith beheading Holofernes is a sensation. Like Kim Kardashian, but with more talent, Artemisia exploits the spotlight of scandal. She uses the exposure to advance her career and creates works that embody her notorious reputation. The dramatic lighting, deep shadow, intense emotion, and bloody rendition she adopts in these first works are independent of her father. His own 1613 interpretation of the subject is clearly not her model. Artemisia has flown the nest and acted upon the inspiration of Caravaggio. His version of the same subject from 1599 is one of the few that describes the moment Artemisia chooses to portray. The slicing of flesh, spurting of blood, and position of Holofernes are all recognizable in Artemisia's version of events. But Caravaggio's servant is a typical old crone, a remote assistant to the assault, and Judith is rather unconvincing in her action. Her erect nipples give her away as emblem of male fantasy. Caravaggio's influence upon painting was huge. A cult of followers, many of them Dutch, are referred to as the Caravaggisti, such as Hendrik te Broekhuizen, The Concert from 1626, and also Gerrit van Honthorst, Christ Before the High Priest from 1617, both paintings also in the National Gallery's collection in London. Their works mimicked Caravaggio's bold lighting, condemning huge swathes of canvas to shadow, whilst figures are lit by a single light source. Caravaggio was a friend of Orazio and would have been known to Artemisia in person and through his art. Artemisia's local church, Santa Maria de Popolo, was a spiritual space of special significance. Her mother's burial service took place in its Orazio chapel, which houses Caravaggio's magnificent The Crucifixion of St. Peter and the Conversion of St. Paul from 1601. St. Peter is heaved into position, crucified upon an inverted cross at his request, so as not to mimic the cross upon which Christ was nailed. His body is muscular and youthful despite his years. His weight is tangible in the taut rope and strained muscles of the limbs that struggle to raise the cross. The separation of colour about St. Peter is exquisite. Red, yellow, blue, and green, the white of the robe at the centre. On the opposite wall is St. Paul, who has fallen from his horse as he sees the light and begins his journey of conversion to Christianity. His open arms form a loop that reaches to the buttocks and muzzle of the horse. The animal's leg is raised in reaction and provides a shape that fits beautifully into the space created by Paul's arms. Only Caravaggio's bold talent could pull off such a divine canvas, a quarter of which consists of a horse's bottom. Caravaggio was a visual agent of the Catholic Church. He designed paintings to keep the congregation faithful. The Church reinstated the authority of the image as part of its Counter-Reformation campaign. Caravaggio established an immediate emotional connection with the viewer through recognition. His models cast in divine roles were from the streets of Rome, and he did not care to edit out their life experiences for the purpose of idealization. Their feet are dirty, their nose is ruddy, their features worn by work. Caravaggio produced images unlike anything seen before. The Taking of Christ from 1602 shows the moment Judas kisses the cheek of Christ, revealing his identity to the armored Roman soldiers who will later crucify him. The emotion contained within the frame is palpable. The realism it describes would have provoked distress and alarm from the devoutly Catholic audience, distraught at such a vivid portrayal of their Saviour, betrayed and incarcerated. Caravaggio had given paintings the authority to provoke reactions usually reserved for the stage. The Renaissance, a century or so earlier, had brought about its own sensation in its ability to depict three-dimensional architectural space upon a two-dimensional surface, seen here in Bellini's painting from 1505 in San Zaccaria, an illusion made possible by one-point perspective. But the Renaissance ideal that possessed the ordered clarity of classical proportions was soon to make way for the Baroque. A movement that was erratic, restless, salacious, exuberant, and dangerous. Swirling fabrics and piles of body signaled a desire for more, more, more. And this is Rubens' War and Peace from 1629, also in the National Gallery's collection in London. Artemisia emerges at the beginning of this period of art, trained by her father, emboldened by Caravaggio's light, encouraged by the current taste for drama, and equipped with a sensational personal narrative. She is able to produce Judith slaying Holofernes. The painting is produced in the immediate aftermath of the rape trial, and so it becomes an illustration of the revenge Artemisia would like to reap upon her attacker, Tassi. The figure of Judith does bear a resemblance to the young painter, which of course adds fuel to the fire. But the subject of Judith was a supremely popular one throughout the first half of the 17th century. It describes the story of Judith, a widow whose town in Israel was under attack from Assyrian forces. Rather than stand by and do nothing, Judith decides to walk up to the Assyrian camp with her servant Abra and demand to see the general Holofernes. Dressed up in her finery, she meets her intended target, whom she spends 4 days with. On the last day, she bewitches Holofernes without removing a single item of her clothing and manages to get him so drunk that he is powerless to resist her attack. She and Abra sneak out of the camp with his head in a basket, which she displays upon enemy lines. The Assyrian army are so baffled as to how Holofernes has ended up with his head on a spike. They retreat in horror, and Judith's town is freed. Well done, Judith. However, many artists who paint this scene fail to see Judith as a heroine who, without even having sex with anyone, has bravely liberated her town. The majority of artistic renditions pollute Judith's courage and rebrand the fable to be opposed to feminine power. Even when her charm, deception, and bravery is used for the greater good, it is not right that a woman should cut off a man's head and be a hero. Judith is recast as a warning to men. She appears as a dangerous seductress who probably wants to cut all men's heads off, a sentiment shared by Cristofano Allori. This is his painting from 1613, and Johann Liss This is his work in the National Gallery's collection from 1622, and Rubens' Judith, a particularly naughty Judith, from 1616. Even fellow female painter Elisabetta Sarani skips the gruesome part to show a beautifully delicate young woman, dreamily gazing beyond the frame in her mid-17th century version. All aspects of the story that might cause disgust or unease are absent. Only a slight trail of blood alludes to the violent act which has occurred. It is important to remember that it is not Artemisia's sex or personal history that enables her to create the work she does. It is her ability to reveal universal content previously overlooked within rehearsed themes. Virginia Vesey's version of Judith from 1624 is a little more knowing, mischievous, and even a little smug. Vesey is likely to have known Artemisia through her husband, Simon Vouet, a successful French artist who painted Artemisia's portrait, seen here, between 1623 and 26. Many more works are likely to be by Vesey, but this is the only positively identified work by her hand. Others are likely attributed to her husband or those in his circle. This stunning portrait in the Wallace collection in London is currently attributed to Domenichino, and he undoubtedly copied the composition seen here in his painting from 1622. But his hand is nowhere near as eloquent as the one that paints this portrait. Could this be another incredible work by a woman whose achievements are condemned to obscurity by the attribution of their effort to a man? Or could it be an Artemisia? The earring certainly appears in at least two of her other paintings, seen here in a later Susanna of the same time. Will we ever know? As demonstrated, Judith and Holofernes was the subject of the moment. It was not a story unearthed by Artemisia to be used as a vehicle to express her distress and anger at being raped. It was an opportunity, and her response is ingenious. Artemisia does not attempt to counteract the misogynist reproach of Judith by emphasizing the heroic nature of her act, by showing all the people she saved from her town. She instead chooses to scare the bejesus out of any man who might witness the work. This is the moment Holofernes is between life and death. His heart is still redundantly beating around his body, beating blood around his body, which spurts out, spraying Judith's breast and dress. She squints to avoid getting it in her eyes. Abra, Judith's servant, is upon him, holding his left arm down, her knee presumably pressed upon his side. Judith grabs his hair between her fingers as she relieves the general of his head with his own sword. The women are silent, calm, and united in their strength and concentration. They work together, and no hierarchy is suggested between servant and master as they collaborate upon the dark deed. The way Holofernes is killed, overpowered by two women when blind drunk, is a credible feat. I believe Artemisia is intent on producing a work that is plausible. She is not, as the current Uffizi label describes, letting off steam in light of her rape. Artemisia takes satisfaction in showing men how it was done. It turns out the beheading of Holofernes is not such an inconceivable feat, and her blunt description of how a woman cut off a man's head is not particularly sexy, an achievement that hails an engaging new interpretation of the subject. We are shown what was necessary, not what was desirable. It is likely the first version, painted around 1612 to 14, was cut down on the left-hand side at a later date. So let us continue to assess the second version, painted around 1620, when appreciating the spectacular composition Artemisia has configured. The complexity of the design becomes apparent when one starts to draw from this work. To grasp its basic structure, you make marks that echo a fan, with Holofernes' head at its center. His right arm weaves in and out of Abra's left. Its limp fist seems to pose little threat to the maid's face, beautifully rendered in half shadow, her cheek flushed with activity. Judith's arms are locked in a parallel formation. One supports a splendid bracelet, absent from the earlier version, along with her ochre dress of luxurious fabric and carefully styled hair. Judith's look has been upgraded, possibly to satisfy the lavish tastes of her patron Cosimo II of Medici, or to show how Artemisia is familiar with such high-class fashion. The sinister black void of the tent focuses all our attention on the activity of the figures. The distribution of colour is shared across the primaries. Red, blue, and yellow orbit Holofernes' head. His bare legs echo the shape of Judith's arms. The space between brilliantly frames the spurts of blood, which trickle down into the creases of the bed. The sheets are smudged red by the squirming body, soon to be still. Cosimo died shortly after receiving the work, and Artemisia makes reference to its near destruction in a letter to Galileo. She writes, "That Judith which I gave to his serene highness the Grand Duke Cosimo of glorious memory, which would have been lost to memory had it not been revived by your lordship's assistance. It can therefore be assumed that Cosimo was unusual in his appetite for such a painting, and that in his absence those who inherited the work were not particularly keen to keep it. The painting has certainly provoked some amusing theories and observations. A 19th century personality was said to have remarked, 'The woman who painted such a work could not have been married.' The image has also been read as a birth, through the delivery of Holofernes' head, also interpreted as female genitalia, a 20th century analysis that incorporates both childbirth and castration. The art historian R. Ward Bissell eloquently sums up the analytical abbreviation of Judith by stating, "No line of inquiry rejected, but none must be so favoured as to threaten to obscure." Artemisia returns to the subject of Judith a number of times. Like her father's 1608 version, she recalls the moments after the decapitation. Orazio's painting contains sumptuous colour, tangible texture, and crisp lighting, but his Judith lacks spirit. It is hard to believe she has just lopped the head off Holofernes. Artemisia's work from around 1618 makes much better use of the frame. The action is tense and close. The figures have little space between them, with Judith's hand protectively on Abra's right instead of left shoulder, which increases the bond between them, united in their task. The sword on Judith's shoulder, its blade dangerously close to her neck, gives her a swagger and power that Orazio's Judith lacks. To draw from this work reveals the plethora of shapes that mirror and meld into one another. Judith's bent arm creates a parallel line with Abra's smooth, outstretched arm, her hip jolted to support the weight of the head. The curve of the basket repeats in the loop of fabric at Abra's waist. Her headdress against the profile of Judith is close in design, but not in space. It is a beautiful shape that sweeps around her back and into the dark. Orazio does not make use of his props and models in the way Artemisia does. Their forms do not collaborate as effectively with one another. Space is wasted and not charged. The swathes of black either side of the figures is not a frame injected with drama. It is an unsophisticated expanse of space. Orazio describes what is necessary to the understanding of the story, but he does not translate it into an idea. Artemisia shows us time. We can see the before and the after, the moment the hushed conversation is interrupted by a sound outside the frame, and a swift exit soon to happen as the women silently flee. It is an image of sisterly corroboration. The only thing that lets it down, in my opinion, is Judith's eye. I just wish Artemisia had spent a little more time establishing the direction of gaze, which to me appears to be too high. However, her later version of the theme is faultless. Painted around 5 years later and currently in Detroit, this work is a tour de force. It is reminiscent of the earlier work of Rubens. This is his Samson and Delilah from 1609-10 in the National Gallery's collection. And even Rembrandt, this is his brutal Blinding of Samson from 1636. The revolution of light brought about by Caravaggio was embedded in these works as well as many others of the time, but rarely was it deployed with such success. A single candle gives out an implausibly strong glow within the confines of the dark tent, but who cares? This is painting. The spectrum is distributed evenly. Red, yellow, purple, blue, and green fall vertically within the frame, and white is brilliantly used upon each figure to highlight them against the darkness. This is theatre. The shadow Judith casts upon her own face with her hand is arresting, obscuring, and commanding. The candle has a beautiful relationship to Judith's hand, which at first seems close to burn, but the physics of the painted space ensure a safe distance. She leans forward as her arms cross her body, the sword still tightly gripped, having only just decapitated its owner, whose head is loyally retrieved by Abra. She looks up from her task as Judith signals silence in the evidence of a danger she does not see but hears. Both figures freeze, frozen by time, frozen by paint, and frozen in the action they were previously committing. Garrard declares that these are women beyond social or theological masculine control, and that for the female viewer, Judith and Abra would have been the metaphor for the life of women. One likes to imagine Artemisia considered her female audience, but the wives of the wealthy patrons, courtiers, and monarchs whose service she was in have recognized the subversion of the patriarchy through sex, sisterhood, and sensational courage. It is tempting to imagine a revolution was building from Artemisia's palette, but her surviving letters tell a different story. Written to 6 of her patrons and friends over a 20-year period from 1630 to the year before she died in 1651, they reveal the highly competitive environment Artemisia operated within and are a fascinating insight into the plight of the artist, struggling to secure prices, payment, and patronage. She is continually required to prove her worth in light of her sex. I quote, "You think me pitiful because a woman's name raises doubts until her work is seen." And later on, a letter to the same patron, she states, "And I will show your most illustrious lordship what a woman can do, hoping to give you the greatest pleasure." Her struggles as a woman in a man's world are clear. She writes, "I have made a solemn vow never to send my drawings because people have cheated me. In particular, just today I found myself in the situation that having done a drawing of souls in purgatory for the Bishop of St. Geta, he, in order to spend less, commissioned another painter to do the painting using my work. If I were a man, I can't imagine it would have turned out this way." Artemisia battles against blatant misogyny and stands her corner, but one wonders to what effect. She writes, "I was mortified to hear that you want to deduct 1/3 from the already very low price that I had asked," and goes on to say, "I am displeased that for the second time I am being treated like a novice." All these extracts were written in 1649, when Artemisia's position was desperate. In light of the dowry she was required to provide in the event of her daughter's marriage, she writes, "This marriage has broken me. I need to work very badly, and I assure your most illustrious lordship that I am bankrupt." The sporadic style and subject matter of Artemisia's work from the 1620s onwards shows how she evolved to keep up with current tastes in the interest of securing commissions. Susanna and the Elders from 1622 in Burley House's collection sees Artemisia replace the black backdrops of Caravaggio with Bolognese-inspired landscapes, which include architectural features that signal the new pictorial fashions of the day. Susanna is a rather fleshy, Rubenesque figure, with the 2 elders leering from above, just like her painting of 12 years earlier. The central figure of Susanna leans away, her hands desperately gathering her robe in an effort to conceal her body. Her legs are seen just beneath the water as her sleeve beautifully touches its surface, transforming the bottom of the canvas to a watery plain that reaches out toward us. The reflection of the sleeve is noted in just a few touches. The tie of the other trails at the edge of her bath, presenting a delicate shadow. The knee is reminiscence of the presence of form evident in Lucretia, a work made at a similar time, and a figure likely reworked to serve both paintings. The earrings and golden curls are beautiful sensations of light, as are the highlights of the eyes, another Rubens-like flair. But it has all the anguish of Artemisia. The psychological complexity of Susanna, as she looks up to God for salvation, is a powerful presentation of the mind. It is a more titillating image than the earlier version, but perhaps this is evidence Artemisia is willing to play the game for the purpose of earning a living. However, the work is formally unresolved. The silhouetted shape of the fountain fills the void left by the sky, but its tone and shape are isolated from the rest of the painting. There is too much space to the left of Susanna, and the intense energy her body creates evaporates into this space. Artemisia has developed her style, but is yet to master how new influences might manifest themselves in a practice previously so self-assured. In the years that followed, Artemisia incorporated the many influences she encountered into her works. The hallmarks of artists such as Tintoretto and Veronese, whose work she likely saw in Venice, are evident in her Esther from 1628 to 35. The flair of Van Dyck, who was in Rome for 6 years from 1621, can be detected in Artemisia's portrait from 1622, and Velázquez's loose brushwork seen here in his portrait of the Duke of Modena is in evidence in Artemisia's Clio from 1632. Artists seen here in self-portrait, such as Van Dyck, Rubens, and Velázquez, were intent on the promotion of painting as a liberal art of intellectual pursuit. However, they struggled to cultivate this sentiment into an image that identified them as painters, whilst also maintaining the message their enterprise was a noble one. The necessary studio paraphernalia that would have identified them as an artist risks undermining their attempt to elevate painting from craft to liberal art. Salvatore Rosa overcomes this problem by painting himself as a personification of philosophy, since the allegorical personification of painting was traditionally represented by a woman. So, for once in her career, Artemisia could take advantage of her sex and simultaneously represent herself and the allegory of painting. Her name, Artemisia, let art be for me, also lends itself nicely to the subject of this painting. Artemisia is thought to have taken the painting to England when she joined her father in the service of Charles I from 1638 to 1641. It remains in the royal collection and is the only known work that survives from her time in England. Artemisia captures herself at work. We are witness to the process of transformation from figure to ground. The artist leans out into the light, her face and body expertly foreshortened as she looks to her subject. She is professional, at ease, confident. Her left hand is beautifully sandwiched between the parallel planes of her palette and table. Her right hand grasps the brush as it receives the information from the eye that has been processed by the mind. The space created by her outstretched arms is charged with energy. The unusual shape the body creates frames a large void of blank canvas, soon to be transformed into concept. The pose is perhaps inspired by Caravaggio's Narcissus from 1594, a stunning painting of shape within the frame of the canvas and circular frame of the reflected body. Artemisia also employs space as an equal collaborator to form, and both are exceptionally positioned within the frame to acknowledge its boundary. The sophisticated restraint of colour shows us violets disappearing into green, which reflects the instruction of a virtuoso technique practiced by painters when displaying their talent. The light that reveals colour also defines form. Contrasting tones describe the right side of the left arm as it meets the ochre skirt. Its glow-like quality transports your eye to the chain around the neck, which descends into darker tones as the pendant of a mask, an allegorical representation of imitation, drops away from the body. The profile of the artist is highlighted against her sleeve, the eyes almost obscured by their foreshortened position. The cheeks are flushed against an alabaster skin, its surface punctuated by warmer tones which suggest an active body, pulsating with blood beneath. The allegory of painting has none of the pomp and arrogance of Van Dyck's self-portrait of 1633, which sees the artist point to a sunflower, a possible symbol of his loyalty to patron Charles I, who has gifted Van Dyck the chain he shows off. Artemisia sidesteps this type of representation, reliant upon presence of personality and symbolic attributes, by instead showing the artist at work in production of a masterpiece. The blank canvas behind is almost obscured into the ground of the actual canvas, a clever conceptual maneuver that simultaneously represents the canvas we look upon and a representation of a canvas depicted in the painting. We also wonder what image will appear on the canvas. She is about to start, no touches of paint are yet visible upon the surface. Will it be the image we currently look upon, achieved by the use of multiple mirrors? Or is the subject the artist looks toward remote from what we see? Such questions are reminiscent of the visual conundrums generated by Las Meninas, often described as the greatest painting ever made, and in the collection of the Prado in Madrid. Las Meninas was painted by Velázquez for Philip IV in 1656, at least 20 years after Artemisia's portrait. Velázquez left Naples 3 days before Artemisia wrote to her patron Cassiano dal Pozzo in December 1630, saying she was about to send him a self-portrait she had just finished. In the letter, she writes, "You may at your convenience lash the image of the artist, who, still aching from the cold, suffered in doing this work," clearly referring to herself as image and artist. Velázquez undoubtedly met Artemisia. Both were working in the Neapolitan court for Maria of Austria, so it is possible he could have seen this work. Velázquez was dedicated in his ambition to raise the status of painters from craftsmen to noblemen, and sought to find a way to prove once and for all that painting was an intellectual practice. Velázquez must have therefore been intrigued to see Artemisia present herself as artist and allegory. Ironically afforded to her by her sex, she was able to open the door to various conceptual possibilities artists could only explore when portraying themselves at work. Velázquez further develops the ideas Artemisia begins to explore in his masterpiece, Las Meninas. In brief, the work shows the Spanish royal family visiting Velázquez at work, who is seen leaning out from his canvas, brush and palette in hand. The Infanta is at the center, being offered a cup of water by a lady in waiting. Her head is toward the dwarf and boy kicking the dog. But the Infanta's gaze flicks up to us, as do the eyes of various other figures in the picture. The assumption is their attention is suddenly directed to the arrival of the king and queen, who occupy the same space as the viewer and are reflected in the mirror on the back wall. Are they posing for the portrait Velázquez paints, which is the same proportions as Las Meninas? Or is Velázquez painting what we are looking at? Every question prompts another, and no answer satisfies all the possible scenarios the painting provokes. Only the artist has the answer. thus illustrating the intellectual nature of painting. Artemisia's work undoubtedly had a greater impact on her peers than we know, and her sex made her vulnerable to imitation without credit. The misogyny of the 17th century and beyond could easily have obscured the fact it was a woman's work that inspired a male artist to paint one of the most celebrated works in history. However, Artemisia is finally getting the attention she deserves. There have been various museum shows in the last 10 years in Rome and in Paris, although a recent show in Paris was said to be selling delicately ribboned Artemisia soap and perfume, so perhaps there is still some progress to be made. The National Gallery in London will soon be bringing together 35 works for their major show, titled simply Artemisia. And the gallery recently bought a self-portrait of St. Catherine of Alexandria by Artemisia, the 20th work acquired by a female artist within a collection of 2,300 paintings. Before Christmas, this work was hung next to Caravaggio's Supper at Emmaus. It would be patronizing to say Artemisia's portrait holds its own. Of course it does. She rightly takes her place alongside the greats from art history, and this early work from around 1618 possesses the power and presence of self Artemisia executes so well. St. Catherine is a legendary figure who convinced 50 philosophers to convert to Christianity after they were sent to persuade her to relinquish her faith. Punished for her intellect, she was tortured upon the wheel, which miraculously broke due to divine intervention. Artemisia paints herself with the saint's attributes, the palm in one hand, the wheel in the other. It is a beautiful portrait of subtle colour and complex composition, where forms appear to rest effortlessly within the frame. Here she is, an artist at the beginning of her career, which will see her paint for the rulers of France, England, Italy, and Spain, and yet one wonders what she might have achieved if she had secured the type of relationship Van Dyck did with Charles I, Velasquez did with Philip IV, and Rubens did with most of the European courts. But instead of focusing on the discrimination she faced, let us celebrate what she achieved without the support afforded to others. Her paintings are incredible. Financial security can undoubtedly grant a greater freedom of expression, and ambitious court or public commissions assist artists in realizing their creative potential. But in an age when many of Artemisia's peers have fallen into obscurity, she finds herself salvaged by the present as an artist who will endure. Artemisia is not a great artist because of the trauma she experienced. She is a great artist because she conducts color, form, light, space, and sensation into the frame with a physicality of truth that is all her own. Art is never a straightforward biography. It is a visual language, and each artist has their own formal vocabulary. How they choose to arrange this depends on the success of the painting. A sensational story will provoke little emotion or effect if the words are not in the right order. I wanted to explore the work of other painters during the course of this lecture, but instead chose to explore Artemisia's work in depth. The following artists: Lavinia Turling, Catharina van Hemerson, Sofonisba Anguissola, Lavinia Fontana, Lucretia Quistelli, Marietta Robusti, Barbara Longhi, Clara Peters, Judith Leister, Joan Carl, Giovanna Garzoni, Anna Maria van Sherman, Mary Beale, Louise Mollon. All women, all working in Artemisia's lifetime. Shame on history. Shame on history for keeping them hidden. Thank you.